Good afternoon, everyone. Today I'll be talking about the potential of biodiversity offsets as a biodiversity finance mechanism, and specifically in the Indian context. So these are some of the key points that I'll be covering in my presentation. First of all, I'll set the stage by talking about what biodiversity offsets are, what are the various types of biodiversity offsets that are being implemented all across the globe. Then I'll try to explore how biodiversity offsets act as a source or a mechanism for mobilizing finance for biodiversity conservation. Then we'll look at some of the best practices of biodiversity offsets across the world. And then we'll come to India. We'll come to the Indian context. We'll see whether India has biodiversity offsetting in any form. And as some of you might have guessed, I'd be talking about the compensatory afforestation framework that we have in India. And we'll try to assess whether this framework measures up to the international standards of biodiversity offsetting. Again, in the Indian context, we'll look at the biodiversity finance gap and see if compensatory afforestation or voluntary biodiversity offsets can fulfill this gap. So what are biodiversity offsets? An organization called Forest Trends has a business and biodiversity offsets program. It's based in the US. They've done pioneering work on setting standards for biodiversity offsets, and they also have pilot projects, at least 4 or 5 very important pilot projects in various parts of the world. BBOP, this program defines biodiversity offsets as you can see it on your screen. I would just like you to take a minute to go through the definition, which is in italics. The key word here is residual adverse biodiversity impacts. Okay, so I'll try to expound on what biodiversity offsets really are, taking a cue from this definition. Biodiversity offsets are nothing but conservation benefits which result from measures undertaken by companies to mitigate or compensate for the impact that they are causing on biodiversity through their activities. Now, what are these companies? What kind of businesses do have a biodiversity impact? Any idea what kind of businesses? Which businesses, as we discussed in the previous session, which businesses have a large biodiversity footprint? Extractive industries, mining, oil and gas, large infrastructure, and even linear infrastructure. How? Say linear infrastructure, say roads and railway lines, tend to fragment ecosystems. They tend to fragment habitats. So sometimes they often have a more serious impact on biodiversity than large-scale infrastructure. So these development projects often have impacts ranging from loss of habitat to reduction in the population or diversity of species of flora and fauna. And the impact can go up to the extent of change in complete alteration of ecosystem function and structure. And now, what are some of the conservation actions that companies can adopt to mitigate or to manage this impact that they are causing on biodiversity? They can take up elsewhere. See, one important determining factor of an offset is that the offset doesn't happen at the project site. It could happen at the adjoining ecosystem. It could happen elsewhere. So one important method of mitigating impact is to strengthen protected areas, strengthen the management of protected areas. Another activity could be according protection to areas which are not protected, designating them as national parks or wildlife sanctuaries. That requires funds. So a lot of programs across the globe are investing their offset funding to protect unprotected habitats. Then companies can also choose to invest in creating buffer zones or corridors around protected areas. Companies, some NGOs in the US have even tried reintroducing species. Like we've heard of reintroduction of the lion from Gir to Madhya Pradesh. And the last activity that I have in my list is removal of invasive species, which is, invasive species are quite detrimental to biodiversity. Now just a quick look at the various types of offsets. Offsets can be both regulatory and voluntary. Regulatory offsets are mandated by the government. Voluntary offsets are undertaken by corporates of their own accord. Another classification is restoration offsets and averted loss offsets. Restoration offsets involve restoring or artificial regeneration of a degraded habitat. Averted loss offset would involve protecting an intact ecosystem, an intact habitat, preventing loss of species on an existing habitat which is intact. The third classification would be a one-off project. You take up a restoration project elsewhere and it's a one-off project. Or you could pay a fee to the government to take offsets or compensation on your behalf. As a corporate, you pay a fee to the government. This is what happens in India. The regulatory framework in India is in lieu fees type of offsetting. And I don't know if you've read about the wetland banking in the US. This is the third type of offsetting in which they set up offset projects and they sell credits to companies who foresee impact in the future, and they buy credits of offsets that have already been created. Now the last classification that I have here is in-kind offsets. What are in-kind offsets? Ecologically equivalent habitat is created. Out-of-kind offsets, if you'll remember in the last session, Mr. Jain from Rio Tinto talked about how they are promoting, as an offset activity, they are promoting vulture conservation in lieu of the impact that their Bunder diamond project is causing near Panna Tiger Reserve. So this is an out-of-kind activity, which is not ecologically equivalent to the impact that is being caused. So just a bit of technicals, and we'll now move to the principle behind offsetting. Now offsets are the last step in the mitigation hierarchy. What is the mitigation hierarchy? It is a suite of environmental management measures that are adopted to mitigate the impact of biodiversity of a certain project. And if you can see on your screen, the first step any company should undertake is to avoid impacts if they can. Avoid as much impact as you can. And if you can't avoid impacts, try to minimize impacts by changing the design of your project. If you cannot minimize impacts, restore the habitat that you have degraded or destroyed. And once you've done that, the last step, and if you still have any residual adverse impacts which have not been compensated, then you go for offsets. So I'll come back to this slide. So adherence to the mitigation hierarchy is the core principle of biodiversity offsetting. You cannot justify offsetting if you have not taken enough measures to avoid damage, to mitigate damage, and to restore damage. It has to be the last resort option. Otherwise, it loses its essence. It becomes a license to trash. So just a look at the kind of programs, laws and policies that exist in the realm of offsetting and compensation across the globe. This is a screenshot I've taken from speciesbanking.com. As you can see, there are around 45 programs that are currently active all across the globe, and according to statistics, 86,000 hectares of land has been conserved or restored as a result of biodiversity offsetting or a similar type of compensation framework. So let's come back to some of the principles and best practices of offsetting. It's important to understand this here, because then we'll try to see whether compensatory afforestation framework of India measures up to some of these principles. If you'll recall from the last session, again Mr. Jain talked about how they have adopted a policy of net positive impact. So most companies have a policy of no net loss. What does that mean? Biodiversity benefits will equal biodiversity losses. There will be no net loss. This is a policy under which they operate. Their entire mitigation hierarchy operates under this policy. But some companies go a step further. They say we'll not only mitigate and completely manage our impact, through offsetting we'll actually create a positive impact on biodiversity. So this is another important principle that a good offset program should adhere to. Like for like or better is again the concept of ecological equivalence that I talked about in the previous slide. If you are impacting tigers, it's a debate. If you are impacting tigers, can you justify the mitigation of that impact by conserving vultures? It's a question to be debated, and like for like is an important principle that is adopted across the board when it comes to biodiversity offsetting. Additionality is another important principle. Now what is additionality? Say Government of India takes funds from project proponents to create compensatory afforestation. And if Government of India plans to use those funds to fund its existing program, the Green India Mission, which was adopted under the climate change national targets, does it justify the impact mitigation that is supposed to take place? No, it is not additional to what should have all happened. I'll deal with this example in detail when we talk about compensatory afforestation. Permanence is another important principle. Impact on biodiversity is permanent. So the offsetting should also be permanent. Otherwise it loses its rationale. Now, are biodiversity offsets an important mechanism for mobilizing biodiversity finance? This is the question that we are asking through this workshop. I've just pulled out some statistics from the web. These are the global funding requirements if you really want to conserve biodiversity globally. So if you want, there's a shortfall of 45 billion per year, USD per year, if you really want to protect the if you really want to manage protected areas effectively. This is the global shortfall in the biodiversity finance available, the funding that is available. If you want to create a marine protected area system of say 20% coverage of the oceans, which is one of, by the way, which is one of the targets, which is one of the IIT biodiversity targets, you will need an investment of 5 to 19 billion per year. For conservation outside protected areas, you will need another 290 billion. So it's increased by an order of magnitude. For climate change adaptation of protected areas, you will need something close to 400 billion. most of you would be aware that protected areas are highly vulnerable to climate change, and species population are at a risk of collapse. Ecosystems are at a risk of total alteration in their equilibrium because of climate change. So this is the kind of funding we require to build in resilience in ecosystems. As you all are aware, at COP10 in Nagoya, 20 Aichi targets were set for 2020, and the estimated finance for those targets was, as we talked about in the previous session, was 150 to 440 billion. Mr. Hem Pandey mentioned this figure. Now, how much of this funding is already has been pledged? So, the pledge was doubled from 6 billion to 12 billion at COP11 in Hyderabad. But as you can see, compare 12 billion with 440 billion, short by an entire order of magnitude. So where will the rest of the funding come from? It's because of this funding gap that the CBD decided to explore innovative financial mechanisms and private sector funding. Now, biodiversity offsets are among one of the 6 innovative financial mechanisms that have been identified by the CBD, and incidentally they are also a mechanism that allow mobilization of private sector finance, because as we've seen, public sector finance is really falling short of what we require. So, have biodiversity offsets been successful in mobilizing private sector finance across the globe? Yes, they have. These are some of the estimates. According to speciesbanking.com, up to 3 billion USD has already been mobilized through various compensation programs across the globe, and these are some of the statistics. I've pulled out some of the figures for the main offset programs that are running across the world. Now let's come to the context in India. If you remember, Mr. Hem Pandey talked about the serious biodiversity finance gap in India. We've already chalked out our national biodiversity targets. There are 10 of them. Mr. Ravi Kumar will further talk about those targets. And India has done pioneering work in assessing our domestic biodiversity funding. And if you can see in this pie chart, you'll realize that most of the funding comes from from the state ministries, and the rest of it comes from the central ministries. But the gap is very large. And here's where probably biodiversity offsets can come into the picture. So does India have biodiversity offsetting? Yes, India does have biodiversity offsetting. We call it the Compensatory Afforestation Framework. It is regulated or mandated by the government. It was stipulated under the Forest Conservation Act of 1980. I don't know how many of you are aware, but any user agency or project proponent that diverts forest land for non-forest purposes is required to pay compensatory afforestation, the cost of compensatory afforestation on an equivalent area of non-forest land or twice the area of degraded forest land. You have to pay the cost. Now, the rates have been determined by each state. So if you are diverting 1,000 hectares of forest land, you will have to pay the cost for afforesting 1,000 hectares of non-forest land to the government. And where does this fund go? It goes to something called CAMPA, Compensatory Afforestation Fund Management Planning Authority, which the government failed to constitute. Therefore, the Supreme Court mandated the constitution of something called the ad hoc CAMPA. Now, will you believe that monies to the tune of 38,000 crore and interest to the tune of 6,000 crore are lying unutilized with ad hoc Kampa? And this is blood money. This is the money that project proponents, user agencies paid for compensation of the impact that they cause on for the forest land that they diverted over the years. Now the government is bringing out, if you are abreast with the developments, they are bringing out the Compensatory Afforestation Fund Bill 2015. It was ratified by the cabinet in March. What will the new bill do? It will try to utilize the accumulated funds and try to institutionalize the process so that the funds remain in flow. It's blood money, it's really valuable money which has to be utilized for conservation. You cannot fritter it away. So just 2 slides, 2 more slides. So let's look at how this framework measures up to biodiversity offsetting principles. Does it follow our framework in India, regulatory framework? Does it follow the mitigation hierarchy? Yes, in principle it does. You are supposed to go through an entire process of EIA. You are supposed to ensure that you avoid impacts through environmental management plans and biodiversity conservation plans. Does it adhere to the like for like or better principle? Unfortunately, it does not. The only activity, conservation activity that is mandated under compensatory afforestation is afforestation. And even if you are degrading a wetland, if you are, totally draining a wetland, or if you are destroying a grassland, you will go and plant trees. So do you think it's a justified compensation? You degrade a wetland, you degrade the entire set of ecosystem services that flow from a wetland, and you go and plant trees somewhere? Does it actually compensate? So that's a question that needs to be asked. Additionality. Now, as I mentioned, the government under the CAF bill is planning to divert these funds to the Green India mission. These should be additional. You should carry out offsetting. You should not be carrying out Green India mission. You should have a separate kitty for the Green India mission. No net loss. Unfortunately, there are no provisions to ensure that. Permanence, yes, because once the land of compensatory afforestation is purchased, the ownership lies with the government, and permanence is ensured. My last slide, or probably the penultimate slide, talks about some recommendations on how compensatory afforestation can be made a more effective source of conservation finance. So instead of just going and planting trees, out of which say 20% of the saplings will survive, you carry out things like you fund rehabilitation, you fund corridors, you fund natural regeneration of degraded forest land. So these are some of the recommendations that have been made to ensure that the compensatory afforestation funds are utilized more effectively for conservation. And I already talked about how additionality can be ensured. My last slide, and this is actually the last one, is about voluntary biodiversity offsets. Now, are there any companies taking up offsetting on their own in addition to what they pay the government in terms of compensatory afforestation? Are they doing anything on their own? Yes, we looked at the example of Rio Tinto in our last session. And in fact, a lot of international financial institutions which are pumping in a lot of finance, project finance in India to the tune of USD 205 million, especially in extractive industries, mandate that you take up biodiversity offsetting, voluntary biodiversity offsetting, in addition to what you pay the government. So voluntary biodiversity offsetting will become the norm in the future, and then probably it will become a more effective means of mechanism for sourcing biodiversity finance. Yeah, so these were the questions that we wanted for discussion. I've just